Now, President Trump visiting Kenosha today, seeking to frame the protests as a matter of law and order, though he did sidestep the issues that spurred the demonstrations in the first place. These protests against police violence we've seen throughout the year, and they're not a new phenomenon. Bloomberg CityLab took a deeper dive into the generations of injustice and systemic racism that has fueled some of this unrest. Linda Poon joins us right now with the story. Linda, thanks for being here. I mean, we have a lot of concern here in Kenosha about what happened specifically with Jacob Blake, and of course, a few days later with the shooting by a person there of other protesters at that event. I'm curious as to whether what we're seeing down there in Kenosha is really about that one incident involving Jacob Blake, or whether there's something maybe a little bit broader going on here.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely part of a broader problem in America, right? It touches on police brutality that's gone on for decades, long before the civil rights movement. It kind of speaks to sort of this long-lasting racial injustice against Black Americans, even after slavery. And all these policies that are put in place that, disenfranchise low-income communities of color, and housing segregation that continues to happen. So it's a buildup of everything. But police brutality is at the forefront, and as I've reported, it's not something that is a one-off case. It didn't just happen in 2020. It's gone on for decades.
Linda, what are some of the incremental changes we've seen over the past few decades? A few things like body cameras come to mind, reducing some of the funding to the police forces more recently is some of what protesters have called for. What is the incremental change that you've seen versus some of the other bigger demands that protesters really want now?
Yeah, so there's been some incremental changes. A lot of time after protests, you have Department of Justice investigations into, sort of police procedures, and they have recommended different ways in approaching a situation, how to handle situations, their recommendations in terms of what tactics they can use, and whether all those sort of recommendations actually get implemented varies by police. And so far, as far as I know, not many of the sort of recommendations do get implemented. So there are moves to ban chokeholds and other sort of potentially fatal tactics, but enforcement is sort of, it varies from police to police.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Linda, what's so heart-wrenching, I think, and particularly about your really well-written story, the CityLab University, a timeline of U.S. police protests, is the timeline in and of itself. The story keeps on repeating. You go back to Rodney King, you go back to the protests we saw in 1991. You detail what's happened throughout the decades. We think of Michael Brown and the protests there after August the 9th, 2014, an 18-year-old black man, of course, leading to Black Lives Matter itself. You've then, of course, now culminated in what we see from May 25th, 2020 with George Floyd. Is anything different? Is anything progressing?
So a lot of that depends on how much the momentum can be kept up. So already there's definitely something that's different about these ways of protest. Its scope, its reach. It's one of the first times that it's reached other cities, and not just urban areas, but it's all white town, suburbia. So that is one thing that's sort of unprecedented. A very divisive election year. So that may, optimistically looking at it, maybe that might feel some change. So, but a lot of it will depend on sort of how local governments approach this. Right now, there isn't really a national direction. You have a president who blatantly denies racism, right? So it depends on what happens at the local level, whether these calls to not just, defund police or, take funding away from police, but to completely reform, racial inequalities and all the different areas it touches. So those are really what protesters are looking for.